And I'm Linda Zias Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody, and welcome
to Arcane Mark. Today, we're going to talk about leveling up your chapters and story beats and reveal the secret of chapters and story beats. So, first, let's talk about the problem that you might have. So, you've reached the end of your chapter or your story beat, and you might be a player, you might be the GM. You can usually tell if it's been successful. You can see on the face of the other players if they are kind of confused or they don't know what's going on. If it's been like a sort of a failed chapter or story beat, you can see the excitement if it's been a success. But it's not always so easy to figure out why. Why is this happening? Why was this story beat successful, whereas another one from before was not? Why was this chapter so much better than a previous chapter?
And if you know what makes things successful and not so successful, you can set yourself up to have more successes in the future.
So, to get started answering that question together, let's first define what the heck is a chapter or a story beat in a tabletop RPG?
So, story beats are generally going to be smaller divisions. They're going to be that steady rhythm of the story, those major events and changes and components of the narrative that drive the story forward. They could be a major, an element in the development of the character. They could be an event that changes the status quo in some way. They are, when you're coming up with a summary of what happened during a story, they're the things that you're going to see mentioned. The summary of the story isn't going to go into, yes, and then the story said that she was wearing a blue tunic. Like, that's not what it's going to talk about. It's going to talk about these revelation, these moments of change that really define the story's arc.
If you have event, pause, event, pause, event, pause, event, bigger pause for the end of the chapter, and so on. In the traditional definition of a story beat, that pause just after the big event that moved the plot forward is actually, technically, definitionally the beat. But story beats is also used just as a way to divide things out of things that are in between each beat, to measure the rhythm of your story in a way where you could have the full story, then divide that into chapters and divide those into beats. Or more traditionally, a play's script or a movie's script can divide the action within a given scene into beats.
Yes, and the rate at which these beats come has a huge impact on the way that the story feels. And the way that rate in which they come changes over the course of the story. You're going to have times in a story when the pace of the beats is much faster and when the pace of the beats is much slower, and both of them can be powerful in different circumstances and useful in the same campaign arc.
Absolutely. And so you're going to want to think about what makes up the chapters and the beats in your game. Now, if you're playing a published adventure, it may literally be in a book that has chapters that are the chapters. And the beats might even be easy to see too, because they might be there's a chapter 1 and then there's a capital A section, and that's sort of a beat, and then capital B is sort of a beat. But that's not always true, because sometimes area capital C could be something that's so huge that it makes up tons of different story beats, or even an entire chapter.
Because those kinds of areas are divided more generally based on the space and the map that's used, but a single map may have multiple beats, or multiple maps may come together as a part of one section.
That's right. So it's a place to start to consider that the chapters and the subsections of the chapters might be your chapters and beats, if you have a published adventure. But if you don't have a published adventure, especially if you are playing a reactive style campaign, a sandboxy campaign where the players just are doing what they want to do and exploring an environment, then those chapters and story beats are going to be emergent. They're going to emerge from the decisions and the gameplay. That's also more common, say, in some OSR style games than it is in games that are more focused on a narrative perspective, where you have very set piece encounters that you kind of go through an expected narrative. So figure out where your chapters and your story beats are. If you don't even know that, it's going to be difficult to figure this out. So now, we figured it out, we're measuring it, but we don't know why. So what makes an effective chapter or story beat? Well, to ask yourself that question for a tabletop RPG, the answer is it's the same thing that works well in movies, in plays, and in books. If you want to have an effective chapter, that means that the chapter should, from beginning to end, it should bring something up that is a topic that is like that chapter's topic. By the end of that chapter, you'll want to have had some resolution of that. But be careful, because if you resolve things too much and you bring things too far down at the end of the chapter, it could make the chapter sort of feel more like a lull. So you might want to consider a chapter that resolves something, but right at the end, it brings something else up. That's the traditional cliffhanger chapter ending that will then immediately catapult you into the beginning of the chapter after that.
And the amount of force that you would want to put behind this catapult varies, right? Because you may have a situation where, say, you want your characters to have a bit of downtime before the next event happens, but you generally don't want to be and you're like, yes, you won, and now you can take your victory lap. But you generally don't want to be in a situation where the characters are like, not only, I have no idea what the next adventure is going to be. I guess we're just kind of aimlessly prep until something else interesting happens. It's better to be like, okay, yeah, well, we know at this point that we have, maybe they have a couple of months before, like, this one thing that they're going to need to address. So they know they can afford to spend a week or two doing some stuff in town and gathering things up before then they need to set out on the road. But at least they know that there's some direction. They know that there's some new information that they've gathered that changes the way that they see things. They know that they have a sense of where they might be headed.
So if you did really finish a big chapter and you've resolved the other thing and there is a few months before the new hook for the new chapter even comes, there's a trick to this. It doesn't mean you can't do that. There's a trick to making this work. The key is you as the GM and as the group, you can decide where the chapter ends by planning the session, by planning how you talk about things. So you want to make sure that your chapter does not end with beating the thing that does not have a hook until after 3 months of downtime.
Yes.
And that you do not start the next chapter with the 3 months of downtime. Make sure that you get that 3 months of downtime as being part of the previous chapter. Make it part of the resolution phase and the conclusion phase of the previous chapter rather than as a slow ramp up of the next chapter because it is more effective in that sense. If you're thinking like the Kisho Tenketsu sense of, the build-up that then eventually goes into the action and then the big climax and then the resolution phase, you put the resolution at the end of the previous part.
Think about, when you're reading a book in a series and, it's getting to the end and you're seeing the conclusion and some loose ends have been wrapped up. If it just ends with that wrap-up of loose ends, then you're probably going to get the feeling, the author thinks the story is going to end here and doesn't think there's going to necessarily be more stuff. This is probably the final book. I'm maybe not as interested in being like, oh man, I want to read the next one. But if, the heroes get to revel in their victory for a little bit, but then at the end you see something interesting. Maybe it's something that the heroes see, or maybe it's something that the heroes themselves don't see, but that you as the reader get to see about something else that's developed that tells you, I have a bit of a sense of where this might be going to go, or what is that mystery that I'm going to get to figure out later on.
Like the teaser scene at the end of a Marvel movie. After you watch the resolution and all the credits, you get to that teaser scene and and it's like somebody will return. But you wouldn't end the Marvel movie right after the big fight, and then for the next movie you have to then watch all the resolution of the aftermath of that fight. That's like basic stuff and the credits for the previous movie and the teaser scene. There, you would not put it in that chapter.
No, you wouldn't.
And I've seen situations where, and I've done this myself as an inexperienced GM, where you end the chapter at the wrong point, and that can cause players to get lost and to be unfocused. But if you make sure that that resolution is in the end of the previous chapter, and then you're ending it with that teaser into the next chapter, you can keep up your momentum and level up your chapters.
And you can consider that for your session breaks, too. That it's often good to break before the climactic fight, so you have time to do that big fight and then the resolution afterwards, rather than pushing on to force it into a session where then you have to cut off right at the end and you don't get to do the resolution.
Unless you know that the climactic fight doesn't have a lengthy resolution and instead then ends on a cliffhanger to the next chapter.
Yes.
In which case, you might want to try to make sure the climactic fight is at the end of a session. So you can actually plan things out. In both cases, they're the same thing mechanically in the game. A climactic fight. But you're using a very different plan based on how the narrative structure around the fight works. And so in this way, you're able to make different plans based on the way you structured things. Now that works for chapters, that works for sessions. And you want sessions to roughly map out so that X number of sessions is part of one chapter instead of having like a chapter end in the middle of a session in most cases. And then it's also true of story beats. Each of these are part of the larger whole. Usually, a chapter is larger than a session. It might be the same size.
Yeah.
And then story beats are smaller than a session.
So when you're doing that then with the session, you may even want to let yourself have a shorter session if you find that it's going to make a better break point, or have a session where you do some of that stuff and then you're like, oh yeah, let's bring in a little bit of bookkeeping that we take care of here, like a little bit more like planning about how we might address things next time or things like that, rather than starting or ending at kind of a weird spot.
That's right. So if you take these in mind, we've talked about how they can work in chapters, but they can also work for story beats as well. So you get the big action, you've moved the plot forward, pause, take a breath, allow a little bit of the tension to get released so that you don't keep people super stressed, but then tease immediately into the next beat so that they're always left ready and interested and knowing what the next thing is going to be. That can also help because unlike with a movie where you might be watching the whole thing, or even a TV show where you know they're going to watch the next episode whenever it comes out, with your game session, depending on your group schedule, you might not be playing with them again for a while. So you want them to know what to think about and be anticipating that, rather than be like, yeah, so at the end of last session, we kind of dealt with this, but we're going to do some of the vague resolution of some of these threads that you haven't remembered from last month. This session.
Exactly, because you want to be able to get started in the next session relatively easily without having all those hangers on.
And instead of having 20 things that could have possibly become the next hook, they know because you gave them the sort of teaser, the start that's going to lead into the next one. They know which two of those 20 things did become the next hook. And it's easier to remember and to plug themselves right back in when you have a lengthier gap between sessions.
And then so if there's a decision, for example, that needs to be made, it's better to have them either make that decision or have are we going to go into town to investigate things, or are we going to go out into the woods? Or at the very least, if the question is, what are we going to do? Then they've narrowed it down to, we're either going to go into town or we're going to go into the woods, so that it's not, so that we know the next thing we're going to do is decide town or woods, as opposed to the next thing we're going to do is...
It also helps you prepare if you are writing your own material to handle the chapters and the story beats in this way. Because if you didn't do that, let's say once again that you beat the big bad, and your next session you're going to do the resolution of a few months and then go into the next story thing, and you were writing it and were reacting to players. If you do not know the resolution of those 3 months, and if any of it mattered and it wasn't all smoke and mirrors, you didn't have that, let's say 2 weeks until the next session to prepare what the heck was going to happen, and you were forced to go into it in the middle of the session where the 3 months was being adjudicated. So it's not good from a planning perspective either to stop in the other way.
And sort of the more that needs to be remembered and taken into account for a particular aspect of the story, the more you want to group it together in one session. Like, breaking in the middle of like a really complicated diplomatic negotiation where the players have to hold a bunch of things in their head, that's especially disruptive. because it takes a lot longer to spool back up to where you were.
If you want to think of it with these beats and these stories like logic, if there is some amount of it that is the if and some amount of it that is the then, you want to have covered the if and let people kind of know what the then is going to be, rather than be like, well, we did some of the if here, and we're going to do the rest of the if next session, and then go into the then based on what is going on with the if.
Yeah, so it's like, if, there was a mysterious, loud booming sound that emerged from the ocean, and then there was mass panic, and everyone was afraid to sail out to sea. Then,
where it's like, if the PCs chose to ignore it,
yeah.
versus if they chose to sail out to the sea, versus if they chose to, commune with the sea gods, or call in their favor from the Tritons that they helped previously. It's good to know all of that, and then figure out, well, how will that influence this plot that could have been going on in the sea? And then be like, okay, so the teaser is, you call upon the Tritons and commune with the sea gods, and they tell you that the Sea Devils have made a pact with the Deep Ones, and this new alliance, tentative alliance, is rising from the depths. And the end session. Okay, I hope you'll come next time to find out what happens from that.
Or reporting of them seeing reporting them, waking up in the morning to see mysterious tracks of briny water in their room, and then they're like, wait, what? Why was that here? Who was in here?
Right. Or let's say they decide to scout it themselves instead of those other things. It's like, okay, so you see this sea devil with 4 arms snarling but putting out a hand and shaking with a deep one with tentacles coming out of it. And their hands are shaking somewhere deep under the ocean. And what does this mean? Well, you'll have to find out. So they get to the point where they've sort of just barely scratched the surface of what the next thing is going to be. And that is a great point to break. And then the next chapter begins with this alliance of the Deep Ones and Sea Devils.
Yeah. And sometimes when, in a book chapter, you can have chapters that pretty much run into each other where, you're right in the middle of a battle or whatever, and then it goes into the next chapter. I don't consider those to be as much like the types of ways that you would necessarily present chapters in a tabletop RPG, when there's sort of it almost feels like part 1 or part 2 of a chapter. But sometimes it is when the break is at a turning point, or there's a turning point in the battle, or something about the cadence of things has changed.
Yeah, the way that you could manage it where a battle breaks out right at the end of the chapter is okay, so you went there yourself, and the Sea Devil shakes the hands with the Deep One, and the Sea Devil says, "So, tell me of your plan. What do the gods of the Elder Deep want with my Sea Devil army?" And the Deep One says, "I shall tell you, but first, there are interlopers watching us, and we must stop them." And then the Deep One points at the party. And then in that case, that could be the same as those books that are always getting the character who's the main character into a horrible problem at the end of each chapter, so that you can't help but turn the page.
I was talking more about when the same fight is taking place over multiple chapters and things like that. You might not see that type of thing is often, because tabletop RPG combat doesn't take that long.
Combat is almost never going to last more than a chapter for the same combat. But also, to be fair, very few types of fiction have a battle that lasts more than a single chapter, and if they do, it's usually war fiction, and then it's a larger scale battle that has many skirmishes, which in that case could be true in a tabletop RPG.
Or it's a conflict where you're seeing an entire group of heroes is fighting, and you're seeing different aspects of the battle
because they were split up.
Because they were split up or things like that.
Which in that case is less likely to happen to the party as well.
But you're not necessarily going to see more of those. This is the multi-stage fight where it keeps evolving, and then there's another chapter of this type of thing. Unless you're doing some kind of major final campaign villain type situation.
Exactly.
Because RPGs, tabletop RPGs are generally based a lot more around that session length as a key portion of how they work.
But you might have multiple story beats within the same battle.
That's true.
Especially if you have something where it's like another villain comes in and collapses the wall and causes an avalanche, or suddenly partway through the building starts burning down, or you defeated the boss, another castle is collapsing and you need to get out. Like, you can have multiple story beats that all happen in the same, even if the GM doesn't plan it. There could be a story beat over like, ooh, that major critical hit drops the fighter. And now there's a story beat as they scramble around the party and trying to get the fighter healed and back up, and will the fighter live or die?
Is there a fundamental change in tactics on either side based on how things are going? Is there is there a change to the battlefield? Is there new information that's revealed that changes the way that characters think or feel about things? Something that they have to grapple with. Characters who come into a situation thinking, we're definitely going to resolve this with violence, and then they learn something from the people that they're fighting that makes at least some of them have second thoughts. Or, vice versa. They come in thinking that's just going to be like a peaceful situation, or they're going to talk things out or what have you, and then they learn something that makes them decide, no, we need to escalate this.
Exactly. So when you take that into account, you will find that the secret of chapters and story beats allows you to keep players hooked on the edge of their seats and ready, which is very important with the large gaps that you can sometimes have in between your chapters because of session gaps. And so I think that's basically it. This is not like a big, giant, complex secret. What I want you to do now is apply these in your game. Try it out. See what happens when you build story beats, chapters, and entire campaigns in this way. And let us know in the comments if it worked or it helped you.
And when you find a piece of fiction that you enjoy and that you feel like, oh man, I want to keep watching or reading or playing or what have you, or one that you're like, you find yourself losing interest in, see if you can notice the way that what sorts of things make you think that way.
That's right. So please like and subscribe. You can join if you want to support us. We would definitely appreciate it. And other than that, let's vote for the next episode if we will have any votes. So let's see what happens over here. So we've got 5 options: build a deity workshop, ask Arcade Mark, save my game Q&A, GM tools, divinations, and prophecies, Arcade Mark plays, or other. Now, just put a number in chat: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Given that no one has chatted up until this point, you will probably win.
Yes.
If you just vote. So, please do vote. There we go. 1 for build a deity workshop from Baumwool. So, oh wait, Rico is here and he's gonna vote for
Arcade Mark plays.
There we go. So it's now a tie. I guess I was wrong. Oh, and there's a 3. So,
oh man,
there were actually a lot of people. They were just wrapped with attention about story beats and chapters. They didn't want to break up the story beat. All right. Well, we'll roll the die.
1d6.
Oh, I would do 1d6. That's not a d6. Okay. So we got a the third one.
Bubble changed the vote.
Break the tie.
3 to break the tie.
Divinations and prophecies. It looks like and that is the third person was also the one that the die roll said. So we're doing it. We're gonna do GM tools, divinations, and prophecies. That's gonna be next Tuesday, the 14th. So take care, everyone, and have a good week. We'll see you at the end of this story beat and at the beginning of the next one. In fact, we've teased what it's going to be as well. So now you can